It is Wednesday, September 12th, from CBS News headquarters in New York City. I'm Melissa McDermott with continuing coverage of the attack on America. You are now looking at a live picture of Lower Manhattan, and the smoke you see there is still coming from what's left of the World Trade Center. More than 15 hours later, the smoke is coming after two hijacked airliners slammed into the Twin Towers, just part of the worst terrorist attack on U.S. soil ever. And here's a look at what you've been seeing all day and all night. We'll get that for you in just a moment. The death toll, no one even wants to guess yet what the death toll is. And rescue crews have now begun to dig through the rubble. They began earlier this evening only because they couldn't start until the fires were put out and they were able to get to the rubble. It was too unsafe earlier in the day. And that's what it looked like earlier. And there you have the second plane hitting one of the Twin Towers.
Do you have any water? Give me one. Bring it back in. Jack! You'll be fine. Don't worry, don't worry. Come on, come on. Where's your... Over here, over here.
Standing tower number one, just we saw some kind of explosion, a lot of smoke come out of the top of the tower, and then it collapsed down onto the streets below, much like we saw the first tower just about a half hour ago.
With these pictures, we don't really need to say anything because just the sounds tell the story. And even though we've seen them all day long, they never cease to be horrifying as we see them again and again. And there you're watching one of the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center crumbling to the ground. For those of you maybe not familiar with New York, that is the downtown area where that happened. There were some schools in the area, but as far as we know, all the kids were evacuated from those schools very quickly. And again, rescue workers have just begun the job of digging through the rubble. So the number of dead is, again, we can't even begin to guess how many that is going to be. It has only gotten clear just now to start that digging. Now, in some parts of the Middle East, there were actual celebrations about these attacks. CBS's David Hawkins is in Tel Aviv.
People in the Middle East who, for various reasons, hate the United States. Much of the Arab world condemns the U.S. for its support of Israel, and there were some scattered celebrations when news of the carnage reached this part of the world. But while some Palestinian militants said America had it coming, all denied having anything to do with the attacks. Palestinian Authority President Yasser Arafat seemed as astonished as anyone else.
We are completely shocked, unbelievable.
Some Israeli terrorism experts say Palestinian groups don't have the ability to carry out attacks of such magnitude and complexity. Then, of course, there's Iraq, which has its own scores to settle with the United States. But for radical Islamic fundamentalists like Osama bin Laden, who's declared a religious war against America and has carried out successful attacks in the past, the hatred of the United States runs deeper than politics.
Most Islamic groups are first and foremost interested in domestic issues. Osama bin Laden's group, on the other hand, is interested in the situation of Islam worldwide. Osama bin Laden views himself as the fighter for Islam against Western ways of life.
While the conflict between Palestinians and Israelis and the unhealed wounds of the Gulf War may fuel Osama bin Laden and his followers, their hatred of America and anything not in line with their extreme religious views is far more fundamental. David Hawkins, CBS News, Tel Aviv.
What we have seen, though, with the rest of the world is that most other countries are sending their support and condolences to America and saying that we need to take action against who is behind this as soon as possible. Now, one of the few things that seems certain this morning, and there are just a few things, is that the hijackings and attacks were meticulously planned and carried out with great precision. Correspondent Bob Orr has pieced it together.
American Flight 11, a Boeing 767, took off first at 7:45 this morning from Boston, bound for Los Angeles. 13 minutes later, another 767, United Flight 175, also left Boston for L.A. At virtually the same moment, United Flight 93, a 757, took off from Newark for San Francisco. And to the south at Washington's Dulles Airport, another 757, American Flight 77, flew off towards Los Angeles. The first sign that anything was wrong was noticed by air traffic controllers, who watched the jets stray from their planned routes. This computerized radar path shows how the first plane, American Airlines Flight 11, climbed out of Boston and, as expected, headed northwest across Massachusetts. But watch what happened. As the plane entered eastern New York, it turned sharply to the south and headed straight for Manhattan. The 767 hit the World Trade Center at 8:48 this morning. And 16 minutes later, United Flight 175 delivered the second blow. The jets, fueled for cross-country flights, were filled with tens of thousands of gallons of volatile fuel. They were literally flying bombs, each with an explosive power far greater than the blast that leveled the Oklahoma City Federal Building. Based on radio communications from the planes, FAA authorities knew they were dealing with a terrorist attack and immediately moved to close New York and Washington airports. And for the first time in U.S. history, all flights across the country were grounded.
The airport's being evacuated. They need to go home.
But there were still two hijacked jets in the air, and one of them, American Airlines Flight 77, took aim on the Pentagon. It crashed in a fireball at 9:38. Meanwhile, the fourth plane, the flight from Newark to San Francisco, was heading west, and it traveled all the way into northeastern Ohio. The controllers monitoring radar watched as the jet then did a U-turn and headed back towards the East Coast. At 10:20, 2.5 hours after the four-pronged attack was launched, the plane crashed in a rural Pennsylvania field.
I happened to hear a plane come through. It sounded like it was running normally. When it come down over top of me, I seen it go nosedive straight into the ground down here. Everything was running fine on the plane, it sounded like.
FAA officials say they may reopen the national airspace later today, but then again, they may not. When the flights do resume, we're told we'll see an unprecedented level of security for U.S. aviation. But even then, it will not be an aviation system that's well equipped to prevent suicide attacks. Bob Orr, CBS News, Washington.
As the nation tried to digest all of this earlier this evening, seeking to reassure the American public and send a strong message to the rest of the world, President Bush addressed the nation last night in a televised speech from the White House. The president vowed that the terrorist group, government, or country responsible for the attack will pay dearly.
Good evening. Today, our fellow citizens, our way of life, our very freedom came under attack in a series of deliberate and deadly terrorist acts. The victims were in airplanes or in their offices, secretaries, businessmen and women, military and federal workers, moms and dads, friends and neighbors. Thousands of lives were suddenly ended by evil, despicable acts of terror. The pictures of airplanes flying into buildings, fires burning, huge structures collapsing, have filled us with disbelief, terrible sadness, and a quiet, unyielding anger. These acts of mass murder were intended to frighten our nation into chaos and retreat. But they have failed. Our country is strong. A great people has been moved to defend a great nation. Terrorist attacks can shake the foundations of our biggest buildings, but they cannot touch the foundation of America. These acts shattered steel, but they cannot dent the steel of American resolve. America was targeted for attack because we're the brightest beacon for freedom and opportunity in the world, and no one will keep that light from shining. Today, our nation saw evil, the very worst of human nature, and we responded with the best of America, with the daring of our rescue workers, with the caring for strangers and neighbors who came to give blood and help in any way they could. Immediately following the first attack, I implemented our government's emergency response plans. Our military is powerful, and it's prepared. Our emergency teams are working in New York City and Washington, D.C. to help with local rescue efforts. Our first priority is to get help to those who have been injured and to take every precaution to protect our citizens at home and around the world from further attacks. The functions of our government continue without interruption. Federal agencies in Washington, which had to be evacuated today, are reopening for essential personnel tonight and will be open for business tomorrow. Our financial institutions remain strong, and the American economy will be open for business as well. The search is underway for those who are behind these evil acts. I've directed the full resources of our intelligence and law enforcement communities to find those responsible and to bring them to justice. We will make no distinction between the terrorists who committed these acts and those who harbor them. I appreciate so very much the members of Congress who have joined me in strongly condemning these attacks. And on behalf of the American people, I thank the many world leaders who have called to offer their condolences and assistance. America and our friends and allies join with all those who want peace and security in the world, and we stand together to win the war against terrorism. Tonight, I ask for your prayers for all those who grieve, for the children whose worlds have been shattered, for all whose sense of safety and security has been threatened. And I pray they will be comforted by a power greater than any of us, spoken through the ages in Psalm 23. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil, for you are with me. This is a day when all Americans from every walk of life unite in our resolve for justice and peace. America has stood down enemies before, and we will do so this time. None of us will ever forget this day, yet we go forward to defend freedom and all that is good and just in our world. Thank you, good night, and God bless America.
Probably the most important speech President Bush has made thus far in his presidency. On Capitol Hill, partisan bickering, needless to say, is forgotten, and everyone is lining up on one side against terrorism. Chief Washington correspondent Bob Schieffer has that.
The Capitol was shut down today, the workers were sent home, and the congressional leaders, in a security measure that has never been used before, were helicoptered away to a secure location. But tonight, in an incredible show of bipartisan resolve, hundreds of members of Congress gathered on the steps of the Capitol to say these acts of terrorism will not stand, the government will continue to operate, and Congress will continue to function, and that the two parties will come together to support the president.
When American suffers, and when people perpetrate acts against this country, we as a Congress and as a government stand united, and we stand together.
We will speak with one voice to condemn these attacks, to comfort the victims and their families, to commit our full support to the effort to bring those responsible to justice.
It was a kind of thing seldom seen here, and in a touching close, they literally sang the praises of their country.
God bless America, my home, sweet home.
And so it was that Congress put aside its partisan sniping on the steps of the Capitol. All those arguments about who lost the surplus, they just didn't seem very important anymore. Bob Schieffer, CBS News, Washington.
We've just received this report from the AP. Palestinian President Yasser Arafat delayed a planned trip to Syria on Wednesday following the suicide attacks in the United States. We've been told by an aide his aides have asked for a delay in his visit, considering what has happened. Earlier, we saw pictures of Palestinians rejoicing after the attacks today, but Yasser Arafat has come out and condemned the actions of the terrorists. Now, for reaction in Europe to the catastrophic events here in the United States, we're joined this morning by CBS News correspondent Tom Fenton in London. Tom, good morning.
Well, good morning. As you can imagine, the shock waves of this thing have really spread around the world. Aviation schedules have all been disrupted. All flights to the United States have been canceled. Governments are taking precautions. They've heightened security at airports, at seaports, in public buildings, and generally they've taken the attitude that if it can happen in America, it can happen here.
Now, Tom, the streets in New York City are completely quiet. No cars, nothing, eerily quiet. What are the streets like where you're at?
Well, at this time, it's only just 8 o'clock in the morning. People are starting to go to work. That's pretty much normal, but all of the newspapers are full of screaming headlines, huge pictures. Everyone seems to be fixated on this story, and of course there is concern that maybe the repercussions, as I said before, might be felt here. There have been a number of bomb scares. High-rise buildings, as they call them here, skyscrapers, have been evacuated in places as far away as Kuala Lumpur. The armed forces of the United States have been put on a high state of alert. In Europe, the American armed forces are on threat condition Delta. And generally speaking, people are waiting here to find out how the United States will react. That's the big question on everybody's mind this morning. What will the United States do?
Now, Tom, I know that you've taken all this information and compiled it into a report. Why don't you introduce us to that report right now?
Right. Well, this is a look at how the rest of the world is reacting.
There's only one story this morning, only one image. Reflecting the stunned incomprehension, commuters gazed at TV screens as the scenes were carried round the world. Some of it turned into hysteria. But there were measured tones from the BBC.
Doomsday in Manhattan, a terrorist apocalypse.
World leaders were steadfast in their support. Germany's Gerhard Schröder said the attacks were a declaration of war. Cuban President Fidel Castro, an old enemy of the United States, expressed his solidarity and condolences. Britain's leader was all-embracing.
This is not a battle between the United States of America and terrorism, but between the free and democratic world and terrorism. We therefore here in Britain stand shoulder to shoulder with our American friends in this hour of tragedy, and we, like them, will not rest until this evil is driven from our world.
But the Taliban regime in Afghanistan, which harbors the chief suspect, Osama bin Laden, rushed to deny that he could have had anything to do with it. The Taliban ambassador to Pakistan warned that it would be a great mistake for America to retaliate before completing an investigation. Former Israeli leader Ehud Barak, who was visiting London, was unequivocal in his demand that terrorism be stamped out.
Whoever is ready to host these kind of activities should be automatically isolated from the community of nations and be treated as a rogue state, and every group of terrorists headed by whoever is there should be dealt with as terror thugs. Only the policy that our ancestors were ready to take against pirates on the high seas is appropriate.
But unofficially, the steadfast support for the United States was also being tempered with a hint of reality.
Europeans may consider that perhaps the close alignment of European and American policy over the trouble spots in the world, over general issues of world policy, may not be as appropriate as it seemed, that the transatlantic relationship that appeared to be seamless may in fact not be quite so close in the future as it's been in the past.
That nervousness was echoed by stock markets as they began to open up around the world. Stocks took a dive. One expert suggested that capitalism is a prime target for terrorists.
Because they're against capitalism, because they're against the spread of globalization, because they're against the spread of American economic power. Therefore, their aim was to attack the economy, to attack capitalism, and to declare that it is their enemy, and they're going to destroy it.
So, as you can imagine, there's an extreme state of nervousness here. The European stock markets, which have just opened, are really quite sharply down, and so the main losers have included, as you can imagine, travel stocks and travel companies and airlines. Melissa?
All right, Tom Fenton from London, thank you. Let's come back here to the soil in New York City, to what's going on here. Whenever there's a time of disaster, of course, this is uncharted territory, but in times of disaster, we assume that rescue workers will be there to help and to save people. Unfortunately, that wasn't the case this morning, as rescue workers themselves were becoming the casualties and making up the death toll. More than 300 firefighters sent to the World Trade Center are missing, as are many of the city's police officers. CBS News correspondent Scott Pelley filed this report earlier with Dan Rather.
Dan, there are estimates being released tonight by the New York City Firefighters Union of as many as 200 firefighters killed today. The New York City Police Union says there may be as many as 87 police officers who are missing. Those are estimates, of course. The numbers will change, but it does give you a sense of the magnitude of what has been happening here. We spent virtually the entire day near the seat of the disaster with those who were called upon to risk their lives to save others. On some of the highest floors, the inferno and the smoke fueled a panic that led some to the windows, where they were either blown out or chose to fall.
I've seen at least 12 people either jump or they had no choice. I don't know if it was by force. They didn't want to get burned or they didn't want to blow up, but they just jumped. And just look at them flying out the buildings like they're paper.
For New Yorkers who witnessed the catastrophe, there was no doubt for an instant that it was terrorism.
It was too nice a day for that to be an accident. We're just talking amongst ourselves.
You knew the plane hadn't gotten lost?
Not a day like today, first thing. It was a beautiful day. How does a plane hit a building on a beautiful day like that?
Firefighters working at the center of the attack describe a scene of overwhelming devastation. Pieces of bodies in the streets and in the rubble. Rescuers climbed the girders of the shattered building searching for any sign of life, but there were precious few. Many firefighters and officers were wounded or killed when the first responders were caught in the collapse of the towers. One police officer told us no one has ever seen anything like this unless they were in Dresden in World War II.
Horrible, horrible. The whole building just collapsed on us inside the lobby.
1 block from the base of the World Trade Center tower, the inferno burned 4 hours after the attack. Police cars, the first to respond, were incinerated by the collapse of the second tower. Many firefighters and officers were wounded in the collapse, perhaps killed. No one can say how many.
No idea how many people and cops are dead. We have many people hurt.
What about the casualties? What have you seen?
Uncountable. Let's go.
Courageous firefighters responded from all over New York City, called from off-duty, called from vacation. Renee Davila was the first EMS supervisor at the scene.
I was there, and I saw the building collapse. We all started running. I ended up inside the Hilton somewhere. I was like trapped. I don't know where I was. I couldn't find my way out with all the smoke and the debris in there. I finally just closed the door behind me and covered it so no more smoke and debris would come in. And what I did was I called my wife. I told her I love her.
Go again. There's another one. Hours after the attack, many smaller explosions rumbled through downtown. Firemen, paramedics, and police officers walked out of the carnage in shock and disbelief.
It was unbelievable in there.
This guy's still trapped. We couldn't get to him. Anybody want to volunteer?
Many New Yorkers rushed downtown to volunteer. These construction workers were from Iron Workers Local 40. What's the job in there?
Whatever it is. Whatever it is. To save somebody, one person saved is a life saved.
Through the day, an inferno raged in World Trade Center Building Number 7, another massive office tower. Firefighters feared that it would collapse. And a little more than 8 hours after the attack, the abandoned building fell. 47 stories in the street. This is what's left of the carefully organized files and lives that were the World Trade Center. Bits of paper blasted into the street, construction dust 1 inch or 2 inches deep everywhere you look. What's eerie about this place now, several hours after the initial disaster, is just how quiet it is. You don't hear any ambulances racing away from the World Trade Center anymore.
I saw many injuries.
Hundreds, thousands.
My eyesight did not see hundreds and thousands. I know that my heart and my brain tells me they were hundreds.
We spoke to some firefighters earlier today near the scene of the World Trade Center towers. They told us that they were under the towers when they began to fall, and as they looked up and saw the buildings coming down on top of them, they glanced over their shoulders and saw the entrance to a subway station. They threw themselves down the stairs of the subway. The building collapsed. These firefighters told us they dug themselves out of the subway and went back to work. We talked to those firefighters at the base of World Trade Center Building Number 7. We left them there 1 hour before that building collapsed. We don't know whether they escaped a second time.
Freedom itself was attacked this morning by a faceless coward, and freedom will be defended.
Everybody back. Everybody back.
Now let's go. Move it out.
You have no sense yet of the enormity of it with regard to the number of people that we lost.
Come on, where's your... Over here, over here. Over here.
Ay, Dios.
It collapsed. The top floors collapsed down.
What's the hell is that?
Holy...
Oh my God! Oh my God! Jesus Christ!
Chaos. It's just chaos out here. It really is. So the Twin Towers fall. It's amazing. It's crazy.
What's this other jet doing? What's this other jet doing?
Holy
fuck! Oh my God! Oh my God! Jesus fucking Christ!
Oh my fucking...
Back!
Do you have any water? Give me one. Bring it back in.
Gang!
You'll be fine. Don't worry, don't worry. Come on, where's your... Over here, over here.
Standing tower number 1. Just we saw some kind of explosion, a lot of smoke come out of the top of the tower, and then it collapsed down onto the streets below, much like we saw the first tower just about a half hour ago.
watching continuing CBS News coverage of the attack